As I said in the last lecture, a door is turning. We're moving from action theories, so the theories of the modern period, into a revival of virtue theory. So let's summarize, if we can, the change. The action theories, or the theories of the modern period, focus on doing. What should I do? What if we changed the question and said, what kind of person should I be? So from doing to being. As I mentioned in the prior lecture, there was an emphasis on the minimum required. What do you really need to do to be an honest person? But in virtue theory, we're interested, since what kind of a person I'm going to be, what is the maximum possible? In virtue theory, sometimes we start paying a lot of attention to exemplars, people that we really admire. You might ask yourself, which persons do I really admire in the world, and why? There's a move from anyone that we might call the generalized moral agent to particular people. In virtue theory, we're interested, well, frankly, I'm interested in me. What kind of a person should I become? If I'm a believer, as I am, what does God want to do with me? What does God want me to become? And there's a move from public events that can be observed. We sometimes think, and under the influence of psychological behaviorism, we think of them as being super important, to the inner life. Now, I said that I would refer to Iris Murdoch, and I did a lot of reading in Iris Murdoch when I was in graduate school. So now I'm actually going to read to you a little paper that I wrote about one of Iris Murdoch's novels. The novel is called The Good Apprentice. Who is worse, Edward or Jennifer? Iris Murdoch's novel, The Good Apprentice, begins with Edward Ballstrom's manslaughter of his friend, Mark Wilsden. Edward gave Mark a drugged sandwich as a joke. Then, carelessly, he left his hallucinating friend in a locked upstairs apartment while an acquaintance, Sarah Plowmain, entertained him in her room for half an hour. You can imagine what they were doing. Edward returned to find Mark dead from a fall from his window. Edward perjured himself at the inquest, saying Mark had requested the drug. In reality, Mark had roundly condemned drug usage for many years. By thus defaming his friend, Edward managed to escape legal penalties for his crime. Notice how I put everything in accusatory terms. Manslaughter, carelessly, perjured, defaming, crime. I think the author, that's Iris Murdoch, the author has crafted her tale so that just these words, or words of this sort, are accurate. Edward killed Mark. Jennifer Wilsden was Mark's mother. After the inquest and Edward's release on condition that he give up drugs, she wrote him letters. Here's a quote from her letter. Think what you have done. I want you to think of it at every moment, at every second. I would like to stuff it down your throat like a black ball and choke you. You told vile, unforgivable lies at the inquest. I know Mark would never have taken that drug. You gave it to him, fed it to him without his knowing, fed him his death, poisoned him as surely as with cyanide. You ought to die of shame. You ought to be punished. You ought to be in prison. People like you should be put away. I hope that you will never be forgiven and that people will turn from you in horror. I hope and pray that you will never be happy again. I wish my hatred could kill you. I curse you. I condemn you to a miserable, haunted life. The claws which I drive into you now will never release their hold. Unquote. Isn't that delightful? So Jennifer writes her a bunch of letters. Now, who is worse, Edward or Jennifer? A utilitarian might say that Edward is clearly worse. He did a lot more harm. He harmed Mark, he harmed Mark's friends, his family. Jennifer's letters only harm one person, Edward. So on utilitarian analyses, Edward is worse. Now, some Kantians might actually say that Jennifer is a good guy, a good person, because she universalizes her maxim, you can't murder people, and this person is getting off because the court has not caught him and has just released him. So you need to try to punish him as much as you can, and writing him hateful letters might do that. Another Kantian would say, no, that's going a bit too far, because her hatred toward Edward might move her in the future, motivate her to do evil things. But on the whole, the Kantians are going to agree with the utilitarians. Edward is worse. But if you read the novel, I don't think that's what you get from it. Because in a novel, you see into the interior. You see into the heart. And what we see in Jennifer is rage and stoked bitterness. This is a woman who could condemn and claw. So here is, and now this is always chancy when you read a novel and interpret the novel, but I think Murdoch is pointing in this story to some of the limitations of standard ethical theory with their emphasis on observable behaviors. Remember, we said that one of the features of the revolution is to move from the outer to the inner. And I think that is what Murdoch is doing. She's revealing to us that the inner life is important. Edward Baltram really did feel terrible. It was a horrible mistake. He foolishly left his friend drugged in an apartment and resulted in his death. He seems in the story to be a foolish, self-centered young man who regrets terribly what he has done. But Jennifer is a person who hates deeply. Now, the novel merely illustrates the point that I was making from outer to inner. Now, as a Christian philosopher studying Iris Murdoch in graduate school, I quickly realized that this virtue revolution is an opening for Christians. I'm going to suggest a question that we will come back to over and over again. What difference would it make for ethics if Christianity were true? Now, when we think about the move from action theory to virtue theory, then we ask the question, does the New Testament give rules for behavior? That is, would it instruct us in actions? And the answer is yes. I put some on the PowerPoint, but there are many others that you could find. Things like, when you fast, don't put on a show, Jesus says. Or, you should pray for kings and governors, Paul says in 1 Timothy. Or, you should stop stealing. Did you know that was in the New Testament? Stop stealing. Or we should sing songs to each other to encourage each other. There are rules for Christian behavior. But if you read the New Testament and just pay attention to the virtue words, they come out all the time. The most important commandments, Jesus said, were to love God, to love your neighbor. That's a virtue term for love. When Paul describes the heart of the Spirit of God working, the heart of Christian ethics, when the Spirit of God works in us, he describes what is called in Galatians the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. All virtue terms. In the second chapter of Philippians, Paul says, let your mind be the same as Christ's. And then he talks about Jesus' humility in coming to serve and even to die. So Christ is an example of humility. In 1 Corinthians 13, remember the context of 1 Corinthians 13, it comes right after 1 Corinthians 12. In chapter 12, Paul talks about spiritual gifts and how important spiritual gifts are for building up the body of Christ and for Christian ministry. But then in chapter 13, the famous chapter on love, he says, love is more important than giftedness. You may have the ability to teach, you may have the ability to preach, you may have the ability to do miracles, but love is more important than giftedness. And at the end of chapter 13, he says, these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. And of them, love is the greatest. So, as a Christian philosopher, and you, for many of you at least, as Christians who are trying to study ethics, perhaps for the first time, the virtue revolution in the late 20th century is an open door to step wholeheartedly into New Testament thinking. But it's more than a philosophical issue. And I think many of you, even in watching this video, have realized that. When we change the question from what is the right thing to do to what kind of person should we be, that quickly becomes personal. What kind of person should I be? When I come to the end of my life and I look back on it, will I look back on it with satisfaction, or like Ivan Illich in the death of Ivan Illich, on his deathbed, he discovered that he had lived his life wrongly. He had devoted his life to pursuing money and status and superficial friendships. Now, I suspect that many of you have an ambition, a secret ambition that I don't have. You maybe have not thought of it as an ambition, but you take it for granted. Many of you think that you will be alive 40 years from now. I don't have this ambition. What kind of person do you want to be 40 years from now? We see then that our study of moral philosophy quickly becomes personal. It becomes, as the philosophers say, existential. Real wisdom must lead to spiritual formation. This is one of the teachings of the book of Proverbs. Listen to my teaching, the wise man says, but it's often moral instruction. Do this, become the kind of person that you ought to be, so that wisdom and right living go together. If you don't have virtues, you really don't understand. Socrates made much the same point. So at this point, our course is academic, but it's also personal. And I can't reach into your heart and make changes, but I can invite you to think carefully.